Welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown, a look behind the curtain of global finance and monetary control with one of the foremost experts in the field. Author of the bestseller Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution, Ellen Brown's groundbreaking work began the movement to create new American public banks. We'll look at issues surrounding the world of money and the systems and powers that control it, as well as the progress being made on the public banking frontier. The program is underwritten by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of experts advising government leaders pursuing creation of their own public banks at publicbankingassociates.com.
Some of the other problems with PPPs is it's an adversarial relationship. And so when the government puts a project together, it's basically trying to maximize the public benefit for dollar. What a PPP is trying to do, it's trying to maximize the profit for its investors. And if there are any savings, then they basically go to the investor. If there's a failure, then the government is always the ultimate person who's on the hook. So then they're the ones who are responsible if the PPP fails.
What's a PPP, you ask? It's a public-private partnership, and it's yet another example of how the public can get screwed out of a substantial amount of money by getting in bed with private capital. We might otherwise rename the platform Public-Private Paradox, because in public infrastructure financing, the private party gets the profits and the public holds the bag. Hello, and welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. I'm Walt McCree of the Public Banking Institute, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the pressing matter of our local and national infrastructure needs and how we intend to pay for them. Ellen's two guests today, Dr. Alphecca Muttardy and Dr. Stephen Hubbard, are economists and policy experts working together with the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition to squarely address the real infrastructure needs now estimated to range from $5 to $10 trillion in cost. How will we pay for that? That's the subject of today's discussion. Now, one typical approach used by governments is to create PPPs, public-private partnerships, which bring in private money to finance the projects along with some government funds. And as you'll hear in our discussion, expose the public to an unnecessarily high cost for financing. Typical profit ranges for public-private partnerships are from 10 to 15% internationally. Alternatively, the genius of the new National Infrastructure Bank legislation would require no new government spending and would not add to the national deficit by employing the funding principles that were used in FDR's Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Alphecca Muttardy has worked with the IMF for about 25 years, and Stephen Hubbard is an expert on PPPs. They'll make the choices before us very clear. And of course, the pressure to do so is urgent, given the deterioration of our infrastructure. As you probably know, the matter is being discussed in Congress right now, and presenting this National Infrastructure Bank Coalition idea would seem to be a winning approach. Let's join Ellen and our guests now to get grounded in this critical public discussion.
It's my pleasure to be speaking again with Alphecca Muttardy and to be speaking for the first time with Dr. Stephen Hubbard. Both are pillars of the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition. And Alphecca she's a macroeconomist who worked for 25 years for the International Monetary Fund, and Dr. Hubbard worked for 29 years for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and specialized in infrastructure and water management and other things of relevance to us. So Alphecca, we were pleased to interview you earlier on the National Infrastructure Bill. I know a new bill was filed in May, I think, HR 3339. So we've already kind of got the vision of what the bill is, but for people that didn't hear that interview, I wonder if you could just give us sort of a capsule summary of what it is, and we'll get into how it's different from the other proposals.
Thanks very much. As you said, we have a bill reintroduced, HR 3339, and what it would do would be to create a $5 trillion public bank to lend for infrastructure projects all across the country. The reason we need a public bank is because we simply have not been able to finance infrastructure through the federal budget or through state and local budgets. Our infrastructure spending has fallen way off. For example, in the 1960s, we used to spend 4% of GDP, of gross domestic product, on infrastructure investment. Today, it's only 2.4%. And this bank actually operates like 4 successful banks we've had in our nation's past, starting with the first one right after the Revolutionary War, and then ending with one during the New Deal. Everybody knows about the New Deal, but they don't know the critical role that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had in underwriting and financing everything that helped to get us out of the Great Depression and win World War II. So this bank, just to quickly recap from what I presented on our last discussion, works just like a commercial bank. It gives out loans only for infrastructure, but it works like a commercial bank. So it is capitalized by going to the private sector and asking, would investors like to invest in their treasury holdings to capitalize the bank? And then it gives out loans just like a commercial bank, takes in deposits, gives out loans for infrastructure. The big difference is it offers very low interest rates on these loans, which mostly go to state and local governments because they own the infrastructure. And as I said, that loan operation works just like a commercial bank. And then finally, the big secret sauce of this bank is that because we're lending $5 trillion over a 10-year period, and we're putting great paying wages into people's pockets, and they're respending, and all the inputs are Buy America only into the production, it's really going to supercharge American growth. That happened the last time we had such a bank, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and it'll happen again today. So with that higher growth rate, we'll have better tax receipts coming into federal coffers, into state and local coffers to repay back the loans. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, that's great. I do have one question on, so the 2% is paid to the people who they sell their bonds basically in exchange for stock. Now, can they sell their stock? Would there be a liquid market for this stock?
Probably not. That's the case for other entities that are sponsored, government-sponsored entities like this. For example, the Federal Home Loan Banks has a similar system. And they do stock swaps for capitalization, and they're not open on the open market, so probably not.
All right, so that's great. And could you also tell us about the bill that's just passed the Senate and why?
We've had finally an infrastructure summer, let's call it that, which culminated after 5 years of the Senate trying to come up with a plan for how to finance infrastructure through the federal budget. And it kept, the hang up kept being, if it's this size, then how do we pay for it? And Republicans that were on this bipartisan committee did not want to raise taxes to pay for it. And so the size of the infrastructure spending kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller because of this difficulty of ways to pay for it. What's now ended up is that the revised bipartisan plan, which was passed by the Senate, is only going to be $550 billion of new money over the next 5 years for infrastructure. And that's going to fall way, way short of what we need. Our estimate of what we need is $5 trillion of new money above and beyond what's the normal spending. And where did we get that figure? We got 2.6 trillion of it from the American Society of Civil Engineers, who've gone through 16 different categories and said that these are our spending needs just to bring things up to a state of good repair. 1.2 trillion for surface transportation, 1.1 trillion for water infrastructure, and then some other additional things too. So you can see that in the big picture of things, $500 billion is not going to be anywhere near enough to cover all of the infrastructure, and it's way woefully short on things like repairing lead service lines and water. We need 1.1 trillion just for water infrastructure, and maybe out of that 200 billion might be for the lead service lines. This new bill only has 15 billion in it for lead service lines, not going to be anywhere near enough. And then in addition, it has no money in it for high-speed rail. It has a little bit for affordable housing, but not much. So altogether, we need $5 trillion. We're still $4.5 trillion short if this bill ultimately gets passed.
And so with 500 billion in capitalization, for people who don't know or don't remember, a depository bank is allowed to leverage at 10-1. So that means you can get 5 trillion out of 500 billion. Liquidity from somewhere, but the proposal is deposits, or with any luck, borrow from the Federal Reserve. We'll see if that works out.
Or issue bonds.
Yeah, or issue bonds. Well, that's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did issue bonds, and most of the bonds were bought by the federal government, but I don't see that happening now because they're so far in debt. So, yeah.
There's lots and lots of liquidity out there in the banking system right now. There's some, for example, some $2 trillion. Dr. Hubbard went and added it up just in deposits. And a lot of these banks don't know what to do with their excess liquidity. They can't lend it out because the economy is too poor to lend it for hard investment projects. What essentially they've been doing is sort of gambling with it on the stock market, and that's caused all kinds of asset bubbles. So we're not on good, solid financial ground in our economy right now.
And then there are some competitor proposals, other proposals, and you did an excellent presentation on why those are insufficient as well. So I wondered if you could go over those.
Sure. There are 5 different proposals for, quote, banks to finance infrastructure that are in the House right now. One of them has also got a companion bill in the Senate. And ours is distinctly different from these others. First of all, these others are structured more like revolving funds. They're not true banks. Ours is the only one that is a true bank. The second big difference is those others are very much orders of magnitude too small. For example, the Infrastructure Financing Authority that was briefly a part of the bipartisan plan but was dropped from the plan, that bill only would provide $210 billion over the next 10 years for infrastructure projects. And as I said, what we need is $5 trillion. If we're going to do high-speed rail, if we're going to do all these 21st century projects, we need a much, much bigger price tag than that. The other bills similarly are in that range of $200 to $500 billion, not anywhere near enough. A second big difference of our bank compared to the other 4 proposals is we don't go to the budget and ask for money to get the bank started. As I said, we go to the private sector and ask, would they like to invest in the bank? On a net basis, we're asking for nothing from the federal budget. No new spending from the federal budget, no new taxes, no new deficit spending, and our deficit is becoming a real big problem in today's world. The others are asking for in the order of billions of dollars to get their banks started. And then a final big difference is that our bill does not require public-private partnerships. A couple of the other proposals do require them. And Dr. Hubbard is going to go over in just a minute why these P3 projects are not a good idea for covering all of our infrastructure needs.
Yeah, so I guess we could jump over to Dr. Hubbard then.
Before you go on to Dr. Hubbard, I just wanted to say one more thing. Any information that your viewers might like to hear, if they want to learn more about the National Infrastructure Bank proposal, they can go to our website at nibcoalition.com. They can ask for a presentation for their groups of people if they have a group that might be interested in learning more about it. There's an open letter that any of your viewers can sign to ask Congress to pass this bill or to get updates on the project. And finally, you can call or write to your congressman. This is really a grassroots effort to support this. It's not going to happen if we just leave Congress alone to its own devices to pass it. We're really going to need folks that are desperate for infrastructure in their area And then in addition, would like to see better paying jobs in America and a plan for restructuring our economy. This doesn't just build infrastructure, but it's a fundamental restructuring of the American economy coming out of it. And if they would like to help and participate with that, they can go to our website and learn some more and sign up for the letter. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Hubbard, I wonder if you could run us through public-private partnerships and why it's really not the way we want to go.
So basically, let me first start, because I'm not sure the listeners will know what a PPP is, and the definition actually is variable. So let me start a little bit there, and then I can go through why they work in some cases, but that's only a very small percentage. So first off, project creation for infrastructure, whether it's hard, roads, bridges, buildings, or soft, as it's now being called, daycare, childcare, healthcare, things like that, is basically the same. And it starts with the design process, which also includes planning, which is basically, what am I going to build? Why do I need to build it? And where am I going to build it or create it? And then financing, which here is sort of the loose term and our general term, and whether it's grants or loans, whether I have to pay the money back or not. Then build, and then operation and the maintenance. And it's known usually by the letters D, F, B, O, M, but you can see other combinations because everyone's got their own particular mix. So traditionally, government does what's known as design, bid, build, and they hire a contractor for each one of the steps of the DBFOM process. And this is so if I'm a designer, I can't write a spec that only I or one of my cohorts can then apply for, because when you don't have that requirement, there's, as you can imagine, with billions at stake, there's lots of corruption, and people write things that only they can then bid on. But as then you can also imagine, this creates a time-consuming process. Inflation in construction actually runs higher than standard consumer inflation. The engineering news has a heavy construction and a building construction inflation index, and it usually runs a percent or two higher than standard consumer inflation. And so this tends to run at about 40 to 100% or more per decade, depending on what it is you're trying to do for very large, what are known as mega projects, which are over $1 billion. So then basically, so if I'm an agency and I'm trying to build something, you can run into problems, which is I don't have the expertise or the capacity to do the project. I don't have the staff hours, or I don't have that knowledge in-house. And I also don't have either the money or the political capital to get it built. And many times as an agency, something needs to be done, but you can't get the political willpower to have it executed. So then exactly public-private partnership, having now talked about where projects come from and how they're done, is basically two or more of those stages: the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. At least two or more of those are done by the same contractor or group of contractors if it's an organization. And so they also may contribute private equity. And so this is where the true PPP definition differs from a lot of loose ones, is that basically the contractors assume both risk of creating the project, because they've got more than one step, and then they also are putting in cash up front. And this is why Congress now is interested in PPPs, and why they're in many of the there's a PPP component in the current infrastructure legislation, is because they're hoping to get money. And so here, just in terms of definitions, funding is grants. And so normally if you're, say, a road agency, you get money from the U.S. Department of Transportation, US DOT, and that's a grant. And so you get so much per year depending on what it is you're doing. Whereas they have many different financing programs where you get some money up front, you have to put more in yourself, and then you have to repay the loan. So here, this is traditional financing, which means loans, and it has to be repaid. And so to be very clear, PPPs are not funding, they're financing. In other words, the private enterprise has to make money. Businesses, the classical definition of a business is go find a customer and keep them. And so because if a corporation doesn't make money, they go out of business. So the advantages, so why do you do this? is that basically many agencies and also the federal government, there are debt limits or debt to revenue limits, and PPPs are off the book. And so if you are basically owe them some money, which you'll pay, or you basically incur a debt, they're putting in equity, and so you'll pay that over time. That doesn't count towards your classical definitions of debt. So it's a way of getting money without putting it into the debt revenue equation. There are political roadblocks. As I said, you can't get the money. There are also, as I said, internal costs. So sometimes the organization has experts and they wind up doing mundane things. When I was at the Metropolitan Water District, they had 31 contractors who were all in charge of rodent and weed removal, which if you have over 100,000 acres spread across the countryside, keeping the weeds down and the rodents down is quite an adventure. And unfortunately, they had very expensive staff doing this because they didn't have any low-level staff to do it. And so eventually they bundled that all up and handed it out to one agency and reduced their costs because they didn't have to manage them 31 contracts. And that gets us to something that's known as VFM, capital V, little f, and big M, value for money, or return on investment, is that you're able to leverage basically everything and reduce your costs, reduce the time, reduce your risks. So back to again now, why is the federal government and those in Congress so interested in these? As Alphecca showed, the U.S. infrastructure deficit, at least the one that people talk about from the ASCE, was 1.9, then 2.1. Now it's $2.6 trillion. That's every 4 years. It's been jumping. But actually, in reality, it's much larger than that. And as you might remember her saying, they have 16 categories, but it turns out there are many more that aren't included, including things like groundwater depletion. 50% of US food right now comes from aquifers that are depleting and under drought stress. Putting the water back will cost 10 to 20 times what it costs to pump it out. Imagine what that'll do to your food bill. And when you put that in deferred maintenance, and you wind up with somewhere between $4 to $7.5 trillion, and some people in Congress even believe the number may be above $10 trillion. That's just to fix what's broken, and that's after 40 to 60 years of austerity. On top of that now, as Alphecca also mentioned, we have PAYGO, which means you can't add anything to the federal deficit without first finding either a tax or a tax cut. So what is this? This is like running a business where you can't borrow money to try and increase your revenue. And so this is actually, I think, highly destructive to the country, the federal government and the country, but those are the rules. And then there's also a financial sector cheering squad who's saying, we can save you, come let us lend you money and we'll make everything better. And there are trillions of dollars of corporate profits stashed offshore, and they're basically looking for a long-term contract with government, which basically can turn into a government enforced monopoly for 15 to 30 years or more. And then of course every business would love to have that kind of situation. But you have to remember, PPPs are not free money. You have to pay it back, and the public is ultimately responsible for that debt. So some of the issues of when you start doing a PPP is that the general return on equity for the investors is somewhere to 10 and 15%. Where does that number come from? That comes from the fact that in terms of international finance, I can go find opportunities that provide at least 10 to 15% return on investment per year. So as the money sort of sloshes around from best investment to best investment, obviously the highest return and lowest risks go first, but you still have to get up into that neighborhood of 10 to 15% return on investment. Otherwise, you're not going to attract the capital. So in other words, if I have $1 to invest, why should I put $1 in that'll give me only a penny or 2 pennies back per year when I can go offshore and find 10 to 15 cents? And the answer is no one will do that. So some of the other problems with PPPs is it's an adversarial relationship. And so when the government puts a project together, whether it's inefficient or not, it's basically trying to maximize the public benefit for dollar. But what a PPP is trying to do, it's trying to maximize the profit for its investors. And if there are any savings, then they basically go to the investor. And if there's a failure, then the government, as you remember, is always the ultimate person who's on the hook. So then they're the ones who are responsible if the PPP fails. And as an example, of the kinds of things that can go wrong in a PPP, where you're basically farming out everything to an organization, and you give them a specification, and if there are mistakes in it that'll make them money, you'll never hear about it. And let me see and part of that is 700-page contracts, which are impenetrable. Part of the crowd that went out and put the third world under debt is now going around and has kept it there for decades, is now looking for something new to do. And they're now looking at U.S. infrastructure as a way to increase their profits. And so they're looking to take all that cash they have offshore and use their complex econometrics procedures to try and get agencies into long-term projects. And the longer the contract, so if you're going to, say, privatize your water system for 30 or 40 years, the higher the risk. So not all PPPs are bad. There have been successes, and historically, the Erie Canal was brought in under budget and early. And of course, also the Transcontinental Railway was one of the first major PPPs in the United States. Things like concessions, insect control, and trash removal. Many cities contract that with waste management or some of the other big organizations in that field. And the reason why those works is because the employees only take a few years to train. And if you change employees, you don't lose 30 years worth of knowledge that's going out the door. Whereas if you have a water system and you have poor hiring standards, you keep losing the knowledge of how to run the agency more efficiently, or when you take it back over, they all leave. And so this is why there are hidden costs in PPPs. In terms of are they less expensive, the Congressional Budget Office has evaluated them and said basically the cost of money from private equity versus the government with its inherent inefficiencies, because they're trying to prevent corruption, is nearly identical. But that said, there's not a lot of, especially for rural areas, there's not a lot of capacity for extra PPP debt. In terms of water systems, there are 52,000 water systems across the United States, but only 880, about 1.7%, have been privatized, indicating again that PPPs are only good for about 1 to 2% of all infrastructure. Another example are roads. There was a Brookings Institute study that showed that 61% of all roads break even or lose money. And so where are you going to get 10 to 15% money out of that? You can't. But what some agencies do is they have a new bridge or a new tunnel, and they'll say, okay, we'll run a toll on that, and we'll have a PPP build it and operate it for 30 years. But what you've done without realizing it is you could have basically done that project too for a little bit more upfront, and then had the revenue from that, and then helped fund parts of your system that are not making money. And so when you privatize it and farm those profits out for 30 years, now you have to go raise taxes elsewhere. So there's, even though the PPP itself may show that it was beneficial, that there's actually can be a net loss.
So you said that the cost for the government was roughly identical. Are you talking about not counting what private people,
that's the cost of, that's their cost of equity. In other words, just looking at the cost of money from private companies versus the cost of money, including the inherent delays from governments. And then they said they were basically the same. They weren't talking about projects, which I'm about to talk about, that go bad and everyone sues each other, or they fail and the government winds up on the hook for millions or billions of dollars. It's mostly just the cost of cash. And so the idea is that the private capital says, oh, we're cheaper. And the answer is actually, no, you're not. About the cost of capital versus the from including delays in government versus the cost of equity or capital from private enterprise were roughly equivalent. And so they were saying that the two processes wind up matching. But what happens with PPPs is that when they go bad, the government is on the hook, and there can also be a large back-end cost, like a mortgage with a balloon payment, which I'll get here in a second.
You said that the companies can go offshore and get 10 to 15%, but I've heard the pension funds want 7% and they can't even get that. I mean, they're lucky to get 5% or whatever. So I just wondered what kind of investments you're thinking of. Is that?
You're right. So part of it is the volume. There's a distribution. So the 10 to 15% with the lower risk goes first. And then if you have basically billions to invest, then you start sliding back down the hill with higher risk and lower return. This was more, I think, historical. The report that I took that from was from around 2010, 2011. I have to admit, I have not seen a report of what the current capital mix is.
Okay. And then there have been some spectacular failures. So.
Okay. So going up the food chain. So there's basically I-69 in Indiana, which was a great ballyhooed PPP. They were going to save an enormous amount of money for a long-term maintenance contract. But what happened is that the traffic projections were inflated for them to get the project. And so what happened was they went bankrupt because the projections were low. And so then the government had to take over at a cost of 350 to about $550 million with the project 2 years behind schedule. And so what looked like a very good thing at the start and was ballyhooed across all of the infrastructure press and the financial industry turned into a turkey. There's a South Bay Expressway in San Diego, SR 125, that went bankrupt again because of low traffic on the toll road, and ended with many lawsuits. And they actually had to cancel the improvement for I-805, which, you know anything about the San Diego area, always has tremendous traffic delays to pay for the toll road loss. The London Underground in 1998 contracted with 3 different PPP groups to rebuild the subway, which had been run under austerity for quite a while. Those all went bankrupt, and the cost to the city of somewhere between 175 to 500 million. And just as a rule of thumb, when I talked with one of the aid consultants who was trying to clean up after the PPP, said the London Underground had figured, looking at the amount of deferred maintenance, that it would take them 7 years of normal operation to clean up the mess for every 1 year of austerity that the organization had been run under. So that gives you an idea how underspending, how badly it affects an agency. And then in general, private water systems, Food and Water Watch has looked at water systems that are privatized, and their costs go up an average of 33%, and sewer systems, the costs go up 66%. And so then we have the 4 biggest PPP failures, at least in the United States. So starting with 3 Mile Island, which was basically a company was hired to run the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility, and running it to take advantage of a small tax incentive. Well, it should have been down, and they had to keep it up for a certain number of hours to get that small tax advantage. And of course, the thing partially melted down about 50% of the core because they had a problem, and then it ran away. And that cost was $1 to $2 billion. In California, the power crisis from 2001, 2002, the California Power was deregulated. This was a form of PPP and privatization. And the idea is they were going to use the power of the marketplace to reduce costs. And instead, the cost of power went up by a factor of 3 times because we didn't have the grid. That's one of the things that the NIB bill will pay for, is a better grid. And at the metropolitan water districts, our cost for power went up $130 million in 1 year because of Enron manipulating the market. Actually put the U.S. into a recession. And if you remember, when President Bush took over, he said the economy looked worse than they originally thought. That was because of the manufactured power crisis in California, and brought in a mild recession across the country. The Deepwater Horizon, which was a $3 billion oil well in the Gulf of Mexico, to save $100,000 on a test that would have checked whether the well was properly cemented close or not, was skipped to save a little bit of money on that $3 billion bill. And of course, the well blew out, and the cost of cleanup is now above $61 billion. And currently, the ultimate privatization fiasco just occurred this year, which in Texas in 1970 took over the power grid and sort of gave it to an agency and disconnected it more or less from the rest of the U.S. power grid. And during that time, prices rose 60% faster than across the United States. And since 2004, Texans have actually paid $28 billion more for their power than everyone else. There was actually a freeze in 2011 which prompted many reports warning ERCOT, which is the Texas power operator, that they could suffer catastrophic failure if there's another cold snap. They didn't bother to require any of the power companies to spend the money to weatherize. And then, of course, on February 10th, there was a cold snap, and for 2 weeks, most of Texas was without water and power. 4.5 million homes, and at a cost of $200 to $300 billion and 200 to 700 deaths. And so what happens is over and over again, where there are these large failures from individual roads to major systems, the PPP crowd says, oh, that's just an aberration. Overall, it does well. And it does do well in a very limited area. But once you take PPPs and expand them out into systems and make long-term contracts, the results are at best mixed. And as you can see, very large fiascos can occur that cost enormous amounts of money and actually can kill people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And you had also talked about what the costs are of not upgrading now. In other words, letting your infrastructure fail is so much more expensive than keeping it up. So that's what, we need to do this now. We can't just keep putting it off.
Yeah, so the cost of austerity over time, unfortunately, I can't show a slide on the radio, but sort of imagine a slope that just keeps on going up and up and up until it's vertical. So it's almost like a quarter section of a circle. So that's about what reinforced concrete looks like when you withhold maintenance from it. So there's something called de Sitter's law. His name is spelled D-E-S-I-T-T-E-R. If you go look him up on the internet, you'll discover relativity, and that's not him. His dad was a famous compatriot of Einstein, but he was a famous civil engineer. And after about 20 years, he realized that every 5 years you withhold maintenance on reinforced concrete costs you 5 times what you thought you saved. So after 5 years, if you've saved $1, it's actually cost you $5. And if you do that for 10 years, you're now up to 25. 15 years, you're up to $125. And so what this means is that for every dollar that we would underspend on maintenance and infrastructure, it's going to cost us $2 to $4 on the back end, sort of like that balloon mortgage. And so right now, that's somewhere between $125 to $200 billion a year that we're spending. And any infrastructure package that doesn't provide at least $125 to $200 billion a year in new money is actually making the hole deeper, and it'll never get to the backlog, because it's like you're running a catch a train, but you're on a moving sidewalk that's going backwards. And so that's going faster than the train is pulling away from you. And so you'll never catch it.
It seems to me we also have urgency because China is running circles around us, and they're basically using an infrastructure bank model where they issue the money, build the thing, and then the fees pay back the loan, which is what, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation model.
I'd like to point out that over the last 60 years, while we've been trying to finance infrastructure through the budget, our budget has gotten skewed off on paying for other things like healthcare, like military spending, and we're still running large deficits. In the $3.5 trillion plan that's come out now that the Congress will be considering, they've given indications in that plan of what the next 10 years would look like in the budget. And they have huge escalations in things like interest on the debt will go up by 175%. Military spending will go up by 15%. Education will go up by 35%. That's a good thing. We want that. Medicare spending will go up by 95%. And guess what's going to happen to transportation spending? It will go down by 4%. So this means that infrastructure keeps getting squeezed out of the budget, which is why we need an independent organization just dedicated to providing secure long-term financing for infrastructure outside the budget. That was successful 4 times before. And we need to have such a permanent institution to provide. Otherwise, we're not going to be financing our infrastructure over time. And the Chinese have learned this lesson. They have 2 infrastructure banks that are copied on our own old model. Over the last 10 or 15 years, they've been able to use those to finance up to 27,000 miles of high-speed rail in their country. This has phenomenally restructured their entire economy. They didn't build these rail lines along any random routes. They actually built them along their Belt and Road Initiative to expand their trade with neighboring countries and also to get their workers from rural areas to centers of work and then back to their rural areas again. And we have before and after pictures which show what the economic development, how it changed. So just take a picture of the areas over the high-speed rail lines, and you see fundamentally how the geography and the economic distribution of things changed. Don't forget, China was a poor country in 1970. Didn't even have enough food to feed its population. And now it has just grown phenomenally. And a big impetus to this growth has been its investment in infrastructure. If we don't do the same, as Joe Biden says, the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. Now is really the time for us to invest in an institution that will provide long-term financing for infrastructure.
Thank you on that. Yeah, South Korea also was a poor country 50 years ago, like desperately poor. I spoke at a conference a couple of years ago there and rode a high-speed train, rail train. It was unbelievable. It was like incredibly smooth. It it didn't rattle, no noise, and you got there in a flash. And then I came back to the East Coast of the US and rode our Amtrak. And I was actually afraid because the thing shook so much. It's like, is this train secure? It's like,
our train tracks here in this country are many of them over 100 years old. They're even pitched in the wrong direction when they go around curves so that they can accommodate large freight cars, but not passenger rail. And the investment that is planned for the bipartisan investment infrastructure plan is to just kind of refurbish Amtrak around the edges, provides food service and things like that, but not fundamentally go after the problem that the heaviest rail traffic is the Northeast corridor. We can make lots of money. That's the only corridor of Amtrak that makes lots of money. And instead of investing fundamentally in high-speed rail that restructures that whole line, we'll just be putting Band-Aid fixes on it. And we need fundamentally to put more rail in our mix, in our infrastructure mix right now, our transportation mix, in order to save on fuel costs, traffic congestion. We waste billions and billions of dollars, CO2 going into the air because people are stuck in traffic. And we fundamentally can fix this, but we have to have a way to pay for it. And the congressional plan, while it's good, it's a little bit in the right direction. It's not anywhere near enough to fundamentally fix our transportation and congestion problems, but a national infrastructure bank can.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the things that PAYGO does is essentially, again, which is pay as you go, which you have to find the funds or cut. You have to raise taxes or cut. So as taxes for corporations and the wealthy have been cut and they receive the most money, that money all flows off mostly offshore. So there's no longer the investment in the United States that we need. As you heard, China is at about 8.5%. We're down at 2.3 or 2.4% of GDP. But what this does is it basically puts a foot on the neck of capitalism. Is that if you're a business and you cannot expand many times without borrowing money so you can increase capacity. Indeed, this is what all the tax cuts were supposedly supposed to do, right? Give money to industry, they go out and build factories, and that'll hire people. They'll spend money, and that it's sort of like creating your own wind. And that was the theory. What happened was all the money rushed offshore, built factories offshore, put 4.5 to 6.5 million people out of work here, and depressed revenue. And so now what we're trying to do is fill in a 40 to 60 year hole, and you can't do it without borrowing money. And so this has put what I call the government or the US into what's known as a graveyard spiral. So those are not familiar with the term, people who get lost in clouds and planes almost invariably go into a left-hand bank and accelerate and spiral into, they hit the ground. And this is what's happening to the United States, is because the cost of everything keeps getting larger. Why? Because it's so old and we can't afford to, we're not spending enough to even maintain what we've got, let alone build more to keep up with the competition, who again is accelerating away from us. And so this has put the country into a graveyard spiral, well, where declining quality of infrastructure and its ability to help produce income will continue to decline. That depresses revenue, which depresses repair and maintenance spending, and you get into this vicious cycle, and eventually we'll go splat as a country. And so to get out of that, we need a different kind of mechanism to provide the cash to rebuild the infrastructure, which can then encourage growth. And there's a number Alphecca frequently quotes, which is from the US DOT, which is the federal highway system, which today would cost somewhere between $4 and $8 billion if you had to build it today, has returned $3 to $7 for every dollar that was invested. And so if we actually did the same with many of the things that we've talked about here, that would create a corresponding increase, more than a dollar for dollar you would get back in terms of GDP growth. But without the bank, that won't occur.
Thank you. So Stephen, you wrote a paper. I know this isn't going to happen, but it's one of my pet ideas too, is that if all else fails, we should be able to do just like Lincoln did and just go out there and issue the money. Of course, everybody will yell inflation. That's going to be inflationary. And prices are going up right now, but it's because of a supply chain, blockages and shortages, and the money that has been printed went into the stock market and financialized things that don't produce things. But if you printed the money and had it go directly, like you said, it went offshore and, hired the Chinese or whatever. But if you mandated that this money could only go for productive projects in the US, meaning basically a high-speed rail, that kind of thing, infrastructure, repairing all our bad infrastructure before it gets worse, that sort of thing. It seems to me that that was our idea in the first place. That was the American system. That's what the American colonists did. And we should be able to do that again.
So there's something called modern monetary theory, which, without getting into it in detail, as sort of an alternate view of how governments and capitalism should work together. But the part that pertains here was actually already been done. After the 2008 subprime crisis, the Federal Reserve printed, I think, if I've got the number right, correct me if I'm wrong, Alphecca, was it $4 billion $4 trillion in bonds for quantitative equalization?
That's how much their books went up by, yes.
Yeah, 4.3 trillion. And so basically, if you have factors of production, which in basically people, material, and factories. So the people to do stuff, the material that they're going to use, and what, the manufacturing equipment idle, you basically can print money to employ the people up to about 80% of capacity. Once you get past that point, you start funding inefficiencies. And so it's like, if you put $1 in, do you get $1 out? And the answer is maybe not, as you get close to complete capacity. But you can actually print the money and increase growth without increasing inflation, because when the Fed did quantitative easing, there are quite a few inflation hawk publications who screamed this was going to literally cause the rapid collapse of the entire country within just a few short years. And actually, if you go and look at there's something called FRED, the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. You can put in, go to Google, type in FRED, and then like inflation or something, and you'll see they have all of the data for the from the Federal Reserve System. And basically, you can look at inflation, and there was almost no inflation, even though they printed $4.3 trillion worth of bonds, which they used to keep liquidity in the system and to keep the economy going. And so that's now a debt we have to pay. But if we just erase that debt, it wouldn't really affect the economy, because they didn't have to sell the bonds. They could have just basically printed the money. But what happens is that it's not a panacea. And if you use that everywhere, it'll fail, because eventually you will create inflation. But basically, I don't see that process happening until there's a large scale collapse, because the people who believe fervently Adam Smith first, last, and always, you won't be able to pry that literally until it's out of their cold, dead hands. So
one other
unfortunately-
factor that's important with respect to printing money is where does the money go? All that $4 trillion that the Fed printed did not go into the real economy. If it went into the real economy, then we would have seen inflation. And an example of where we have seen inflation is the recent stimulus packages that were a federal budget endeavor, not a Federal Reserve endeavor. That did go into people's pockets, and they used it to spend on everyday things, and that has ticked up inflation. So, in fact, the quantitative easing, the $4 trillion, went to banks who used this to provide loans to speculators to speculate on assets. So asset prices did escalate. So there's two different measures of inflation. One is the consumer price index, which measures pickup in demand for real goods, and then asset prices for things like the stock market, housing market. There are certain indicators that show that they're all in bubbles, and they're all in bubbles simultaneously now at the same time. And this is causing real instability in the financial market. So it really matters where you direct money. If you're going to print money, where you direct money. The beauty of this bank is it directs it into infrastructure spending that improves the efficiency of the economy. Trucks move faster. There's less bad water that can even impact businesses, let alone poison children through lead-lined pipes. All this improves the efficiency of the economy. And economic modeling, my favorite models are by the University of Maryland. They did all the studies for the American Society of Civil Engineers reports. And what they show is that if you have selective investment in infrastructure that boosts the productivity of the economy, then you don't wind up with inflation, because the economy grows, productivity grows, profits by businesses rise, and then you don't, even if wages tick up a little bit, overall you don't have CPI inflation.
I wonder about that. In theory, you should be able to give people money, and they, if people want more shoes, then the shoemaker produces more shoes and the prices should remain stable, but that hasn't happened. Why is that? I suppose because of shortages, because it's hard to get people to go back to work after they've been off for a year. And
well, they did go out and demand shoes. Just an anecdotal, my contractor who does repairs on my house and next door too, says that he can't keep up with the business right now. Everybody used their stimulus checks to go out and do home improvements in their houses, and that's led to the tick up in the inflation. But it will not last. Let me tell you, this was like a punch bowl, which is going to run out. So the Congressional Budget Office forecasts that the growth these growth estimates are being lowered even as we speak right now, that the growth for this year could be around 6%, for next year could be around 3%, and then after that, it will taper way off as the effect of that stimulus wears off, and we will be back down to 1.1% per year growth after that. So we'll need another, even if we don't think about infrastructure and a bank right now to finance it, we are going to need something over the long haul to ensure that there is concerted good investment in our economy to keep growth rates up. Otherwise, they're going to slack way down again. And those 1.1% is the lowest level recorded of GDP growth outside of a recession. So that just goes to show you how low it'll be.
So just to add something here, when I was answering your question, I don't want to leave the impression, as Alphecca correctly observed, that printing money and dumping it into the economy, would be great until you see an inflation spike. Is that absolutely you have to direct it somewhere. So especially if you print money and people go buy flat panels that come from Asian manufacturing companies. Now what you've done is you've just basically financed new flat panels, and those don't really have any tremendous social benefit beyond the old flat panel that they had. And so as an example, so yes, if it goes into infrastructure and the creation of long-term jobs, now you're doing something. If it goes into frivolous consumer goods or financial speculation, then you're doing either nothing or you're actually hurting yourself. So you have to be careful. And again, it's not a panacea.
Right. If you're buying shoes from China, it doesn't help.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting. Do you all have things you'd like to add or wrap up with?
Just to say that if everybody's interested in really improving our economy, we're going to have to shake Congress a little bit here, because they're in their rut of thinking they could do this through the budget. And I think we've substantially proven that they simply can't. And this summer is an example of the fact that they simply can't. We're going to need an infrastructure bank. And every single person, that's not going to happen except with a grassroots push. Everybody call up their congressman and say they want HR 3339 and co-sponsored, endorsed, passed, and get this legislation done so that we can restructure our economy, have better jobs with full benefits to help not only fix the damn potholes, as Governor of Michigan said, but get the lead pipes out of the water, truly. Build high-speed rail. Let's look like a 21st century country instead of a backwards one, and not be stuck for hours and hours and hours in traffic jams. So all this can be done. New schools, new parks, everything can be done, but we'll need an infrastructure bank to ensure that the financing is available.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Alphecca. And Stephen?
Yes, just that there's sort of a world of tomorrow that's just within our grasp. So we can have high-speed rail, as you say, that's just like we see in the Asian countries or in Europe, and actually almost every other country except the United States. We're now within the reach of flying vehicles that can, significantly reduce urban congestion, and also can bring parts of rural America who are currently withering and dying because people are moving to urban centers. But if you can hop on a flying vehicle and commute, so now remote rural regions can act as bedroom communities and they become viable again. So there's, we haven't talked about broadband for both rural regions and for urban regions where people can't afford to get connected. And as a result, they are in a continual losing situation for themselves, and especially their children, who are now put at a continual disadvantage. They're running into the wind. And if they are unable to get a good job, guess what? The people who have money wind up picking up the tab for that. So there's this future that's waiting out there. And what's standing in the way is basically this approach that we have to do it either on budget or we can't have another mechanism. And it's very limited. And as a result, the United States' future will be limited. And as I mentioned also, the cost of the federal highway system, if you built it today, somewhere between $4 and $8 trillion. Imagine trying to get that through Congress if we can't even get $1 trillion. But try and imagine the United States today without its highway system through both the federal and the state highways. And we simply would not be anywhere the economic giant we are today. And that's because we're basically standing on the shoulders of the people who built that. And so today we need to contribute to tomorrow so that the future of America is every bit as great as its past. And that's not going to happen with our way we're going. But there is a way to do it. And this is one of the engines that will get us there.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really excellent thinking. So thank you for talking to us. I've been speaking with Alphecca Muttardy and Dr. Stephen Hubbard, who are on the advisory board of the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition, and their website is nibcoalition.com, and there's a great deal of information there. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it for this edition of It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. Our thanks to our guests, our sponsor, Public Banking Associates, and to you for listening. Be sure to check out Ellen's latest writings on the economy and the changing world of money by visiting ellenbrown.com. And for more information on public banking, visit publicbankinginstitute.org. For information on how local and state government leaders can obtain professional insight and counsel about public banks from key national experts, visit publicbankingassociates.com. I'm Walt McCree. See you next time on It's Our Money with Ellen Brown.